Liberal journalist mocks Clint Eastwood in public. His stunning response leaves everyone silent. Before we move forward, kindly hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to get notifications from us. It was a crisp autumn morning in Chicago, and Grant Park was alive with the hustle and bustle of city life. Families were out enjoying the fresh air, joggers were hitting their daily routines, and tourists marveled at the city's skyline. Amongst this urban symphony, Clint Eastwood sat on a bench, seemingly lost in the sights and sounds around him. The legendary actor, now in his 90s, had long ago left the spotlight, but his presence in the park was anything but unnoticed. Nearby, a reporter named Jason Matthews, from a popular progressive media outlet, was preparing for his big interview. He had been following Eastwood for years, his sharp tongue often taking aim at the actor's conservative stance on politics and social issues. Today, he had one goal in mind: to poke fun at Eastwood's outdated views and perhaps draw out an embarrassing moment that could go viral. The younger reporter approached Eastwood with a confident smirk, not knowing how this encounter would unfold. "Mr. Eastwood, it's an honor," Jason said, extending a hand. "I've always admired your work, though I've got to say, your views on politics are, let's just say, they've raised a few eyebrows over the years." Clint looked up from the bench, his steely gaze meeting the reporter's with the calm of someone who had seen and heard it all. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, shaking Jason's hand before sitting back, as though this conversation was just another moment in his long and storied life. "I'm sure they have," Clint replied, his voice low but steady. "But, I'm not here to defend what people think of me. I've got a lot of things I'd rather talk about." Jason's eyes lit up. This was his chance. "Well, I think it's fair to say that your conservative views might not exactly align with today's younger generation, or even the majority of people in America. Don't you think the world has changed since your heyday?" Clint leaned forward slightly, as if carefully considering the words. His reputation as a tough, no-nonsense figure wasn't just an act. It was ingrained in him. But he wasn't about to be baited by a simple jab. Instead, he glanced over at the park's fountain, his thoughts seemingly drifting away before he looked back at the reporter. "Jason, people like to talk about change all the time," Clint said, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "But change is more than just a word. It's a process. It's not about shouting loudest or changing a label. Real change, the kind that makes a difference, happens quietly, through action, not words." Jason raised an eyebrow, intrigued but still confident that he could trap Eastwood in a political corner. But there was something about Clint's demeanor that made him hesitate. The crowd around them, initially distracted by the everyday noise of the park, began to notice the exchange. Some people leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse of the conversation, sensing that something important might be unfolding. Clint, sensing the shift in attention, continued. "I've seen a lot of changes in my life, Jason. I've seen wars and movements, and I've worked alongside people from all walks of life. But the ones who truly made a difference? They didn't waste their time with big speeches or angry protests. They just rolled up their sleeves and got to work." The words hung in the air, and Jason felt a sudden weight in the moment. The reporter, trained in the art of quick wit and sharp comebacks, wasn't sure how to respond. For the first time in his career, he felt as though he had underestimated his subject. The crowd, which had been quietly listening, began murmuring amongst themselves. Some nodded, others whispered to each other. It was clear that Clint Eastwood wasn't just speaking for himself, he was tapping into something deeper, something that resonated with those around him. Jason cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure, but Clint's words had already begun to sink in. The journalist had hoped for a snarky back and forth, a moment to paint Eastwood as an out-of-touch old man. Instead, he had been met with a quiet wisdom that defied his expectations. The tension in the air was palpable, and the small crowd that had gathered around them remained silent, waiting for the next part of the conversation. The reporter had lost his confidence, and Eastwood had made it clear that this was not a battle of words, it was about something far more significant. And just like that, the dynamic of the conversation shifted. Clint Eastwood had subtly, yet effectively, changed the narrative. The conversation between Clint Eastwood and Jason Matthews hung in the air like a thick fog. Jason, who had always prided himself on his quick wit and sharp tongue, suddenly felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His usual confidence seemed to evaporate, replaced by an unfamiliar unease. He had expected Eastwood to defend his views, perhaps even argue. But instead, Clint's calm, reflective demeanor had left him feeling almost out of place. For a moment, Jason fumbled for his words, trying to regain control of the narrative. "So, you're saying," he began, his voice uncertain, "that real change doesn't come from speaking up? That action is more important than the words we use?" Clint nodded, his expression unwavering. "Exactly. Look, I've worked in Hollywood for most of my life. I've seen how easy it is for people to talk about what should be done. But when it comes down to it, the ones who really make things happen aren't the loudest voices. They're the ones who show up, day after day, and just get to work." Jason's mind raced, but Clint wasn't done. He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I've been involved in politics for a while now, too. But let me tell you something, it's not the rallies or the speeches that create change. It's the people who show up on the ground. The ones who spend time fixing what's broken, not just complaining about it." The reporter tried to salvage the situation by pushing forward, his instinct to challenge Eastwood still strong. "But you have to admit, Clint, that the world is different now. People want to hear action through policies, through laws. They want leaders who speak out and fight for them." Clint's eyes softened. "I don't think the world's changed as much as you think. People have always wanted change. The only difference now is the way we talk about it. Social media and the news have made it easier to shout louder. But the loudest person in the room isn't always the one who's going to make the most impact." Jason felt a pang of uncertainty. This wasn't the response he'd anticipated. The crowd around them, initially drawn to the scene by curiosity, was now watching intently. The group had grown larger, and some of the faces were clearly listening to Clint's words, nodding in agreement. The subtle power of his argument began to have an effect. Jason, now aware of how much attention they were drawing, realized the narrative was slipping away from him. His usual sharp questions seemed inadequate in the face of Clint's grounded wisdom. Clint continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. "Take a look around you, Jason. This city, Chicago, it's a place of real change. But it wasn't built on speeches or grandstanding. It was built on hard work, long nights, and people coming together to get things done. Real change happens when people stop talking and start doing. That's the difference." The crowd had now grown to a noticeable size, with passers-by stopping to eavesdrop. Some had even pulled out their phones to record the interaction. Jason's usual approach of throwing sharp critiques had backfired. The reporter could sense that the crowd was beginning to align with Clint's perspective, a shift that made him uncomfortable. Clint's words echoed through the park, and there was a subtle power in his tone that Jason couldn't ignore. The actor wasn't just speaking from experience, he was offering a philosophy, one that stood in stark contrast to the flashy, headline-grabbing rhetoric often found in today's media. It was clear that Clint wasn't trying to be right, he was simply offering his perspective on how to make a real, lasting difference. Jason, still feeling the pressure of the moment, tried to redirect the conversation. "So, Clint, you're basically saying that all this talk about progress is overrated? That we should just get back to the old way of doing things?" Clint smiled, but it wasn't a smile of mockery, it was a knowing, measured smile. "No, not at all. What I'm saying is that we have to be careful about how we define progress. Progress isn't just about new ideas or fancy slogans. It's about action. Real, meaningful action. And when you've lived through as many changes as I have, you start to realize that it's not always the loudest voice that makes the biggest difference." For a moment, there was silence. Jason's mind was still spinning, trying to grasp the full impact of what Clint was saying. And then, just as the weight of the conversation settled in, Clint added one last point, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. And if you're really going to make change, you don't need to spend your time worrying about how loud you can yell. You just need to focus on what's in front of you. The reporter was now at a crossroads. He could try to counter Clint's words, push back against the calm wisdom of a man who had lived through so much. Or, he could let the moment stand, a moment where words weren't enough, and action spoke louder than any argument. As the crowd quietly processed Clint's response, Jason felt the shift in the atmosphere. There was a quiet understanding among the onlookers, and it was clear that Clint's words had struck a chord with them. The reporter's usual arrogance had begun to deflate, and for the first time in his career, he felt outmatched, his confidence slipping away. As Clint Eastwood's words echoed in the air, the crowd around them seemed to pause in collective contemplation. The hum of the park, once filled with the sounds of children playing and people walking by, had quieted. It was as if the energy in the space had shifted. Jason Matthews, the reporter who had hoped to corner Eastwood with his sharp questions, now found himself caught in a moment of uncomfortable silence. The crowd's reaction to Clint's calm yet powerful perspective was undeniable. People exchanged glances, whispered softly to one another, and nodded. It was clear that something had resonated deeply with them. Jason's thoughts raced as he tried to regain his footing. He had been expecting a confrontation, an exchange of harsh words or a fiery rebuttal from Clint. Instead, he had received a lesson in humility, delivered with a calmness that was both disarming and powerful. The reporter opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fall flat. For the first time, he didn't know what to say next. Clint noticed the shift in Jason's demeanor and leaned back slightly on the bench, as if giving the reporter space to process. You know, Jason, it's not about whether or not you agree with me, Clint said, his voice softer now. What matters is that you understand the difference between talking about something and actually doing it. Words are easy. Action? That takes guts. Jason swallowed hard, realizing that Clint wasn't just talking about political ideology or social change, he was speaking about something deeper, a philosophy of life that transcended political lines. Clint wasn't advocating for one side or the other, he was advocating for substance over spectacle, for results over rhetoric. The reporter, who had prided himself on being able to twist anyone's words into something newsworthy, now felt exposed. He was out of his depth. The crowd around them had grown even larger. It was no longer just a few curious onlookers. There were families with strollers, elderly couples enjoying a walk, and even a few college students who had taken a break from their studies to see what was happening. Jason could feel the weight of their eyes on him, watching, waiting to see how he would respond. Clint's gaze remained steady, unwavering. He seemed unaffected by the attention, as though he was used to being in the spotlight, used to having his beliefs scrutinized. But Jason, for the first time, felt the sting of his own ego being challenged. He had come here to rattle Clint Eastwood, to make the actor seem out of touch or irrelevant. Instead, he had been shown that perhaps it was he who was out of touch with what truly mattered. So, you're saying that the loudest voices in the room don't always have the most impact? Jason finally asked, his voice lacking the sharpness it had carried just moments before. Clint nodded, his expression almost wistful. Exactly. The loudest voices often drown out the real work that's being done. People talk about what they want, but the ones who really make a difference don't have time for grand speeches. They're too busy doing what needs to be done. They don't need the applause, the headlines, or the likes on social media. They just get to work. Jason's mind began to churn with new ideas, ones he hadn't considered before. Could Clint really be right? Was it possible that the noise of modern politics and social movements was overshadowing the quieter, more impactful actions happening every day across the country? His focus, as a reporter, had always been on the sensational, on the big headlines, the viral moments. But now, in this park in the heart of Chicago, he realized that perhaps he had been missing something far more important. The crowd, meanwhile, continued to grow, now gathered in a loose circle around Clint and Jason. A young woman, who had been listening intently, leaned over to her friend and whispered, "He's got a point, you know. People talk all the time about wanting change, but how many of us are actually out there, making it happen?" Her friend nodded, her gaze fixed on Clint. "It's true. We need less talk and more action. Maybe that's what the world really needs, people who don't just complain, but who actually do something about it." Jason felt the shift in the crowd's mood. What had started as a tense and potentially combative interview had transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer just a discussion about politics or ideology, it had become a reflection on personal responsibility, on what it meant to make a difference in a world that often seemed overwhelmed by noise. Clint, noticing the change in the atmosphere, gave a small smile, one that spoke of years of experience, of having seen the world change in both frustrating and inspiring ways. "It's easy to get caught up in the noise," Clint said softly, almost as if speaking more to the crowd than to Jason. "But the real difference makers aren't always the ones who shout the loudest. They're the ones who do the work, day in and day out. And that's the kind of change that lasts." Jason, once filled with the urge to challenge and confront, now found himself listening, absorbing Clint's words. There was no sharp retort left on his tongue, no clever follow-up. The reporter's confidence, so easily wielded in the past, had evaporated, replaced by something more reflective. He felt, for the first time, that the story he had come here to write might not be the story that would come out of this interview at all. And as Clint's words settled over the park, Jason knew that this would be a conversation he would never forget. One that would stay with him long after he had returned to his newsroom. For the first time in his career, Jason Matthews wasn't the one holding the pen, Clint Eastwood had taken the lead. The quiet murmurs of the crowd surrounded them like a gentle wave, an undercurrent of curiosity and reflection. Jason Matthews stood there, momentarily at a loss for words. For a journalist whose entire career had been built on the art of challenging others, dissecting their statements, and finding a way to make headlines, Clint Eastwood had just handed him a mirror. Instead of taking a position, Eastwood had gently pointed out the limitations of Jason's approach, without needing to say much at all. Jason glanced around the crowd, noticing the expressions on people's faces. Some nodded thoughtfully, others seemed deep in consideration, and a few had even moved closer to Clint, as if drawn in by his presence and the power of his words. The park, which had been full of the usual city noise, now felt oddly still, like a moment suspended in time. It was clear that Clint wasn't just speaking to Jason anymore, he was speaking to everyone around them. The weight of the conversation sank in as Jason shifted on his feet. He had initially believed that he could control the direction of this interview, could steer Clint into a corner where the actor's age and political views could be ridiculed. But Clint, with all his experience and quiet resolve, had turned the tables. The focus of the conversation wasn't about Clint's views. It was about the deeper, more fundamental issue of how real change is made in the world. Jason's inner reporter began to resurface. He reached for his notebook, as if to jot down a follow-up question, but his hand hesitated. What could he possibly ask that would add anything meaningful to what Clint had just said? The questions that had seemed so sharp just moments before now felt hollow. How could he continue the interview without simply repeating what had already been said? He could ask more about Clint's past, his career, or his political views, but he knew, deep down, that he had already learned more in the past 10 minutes than he had in years of covering politics. Clint, sensing Jason's hesitation, looked at him with the same steady gaze that had defined their conversation from the start. "You know," Clint said, breaking the silence, "sometimes it's not the questions you ask that matter. It's what you do with the answers when you get them." Jason paused, absorbing Clint's words. "And what do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice softer now, more reflective than before. Clint gave a small, knowing smile. "What I mean is, you can ask questions all day long. But if you don't take the time to listen to the answers, to really understand them, then what's the point? The real change happens when people stop talking and start doing something with what they've learned." Jason had heard a version of this idea before. Politicians, pundits, and even his professors in journalism school had talked about the importance of listening. But somehow, hearing it from Clint Eastwood, delivered in that quiet, no-nonsense way of his, made it feel different. It wasn't just a lesson in journalism. It was a lesson in life. Jason's thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the crowd. A woman, perhaps in her late 20s, had stepped forward and, with a smile, addressed Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, I've been listening to everything you've said, and you're right. We spend so much time talking about the things we want to change, but how many of us are actually doing the work?" Clint's eyes softened, and he nodded in acknowledgement. "Exactly," he said, looking directly at the woman. "It's easy to sit back and point out what's wrong with the world. It's harder to roll up your sleeves and get in the trenches. That's where real change happens." The crowd had grown more engaged, some people now stepping closer to hear better. Jason could sense the shift in the atmosphere. What had begun as a one-on-one interview had turned into an informal conversation with the park as the backdrop. It was no longer just about Clint Eastwood's political views, or even the reporter's career. This was a moment of collective reflection, as the audience, now fully invested in Clint's words, grappled with the weight of what was being said. Jason felt a growing sense of unease. He had come here with a mission, to challenge Clint, to expose contradictions, to make a story. But now, with each passing moment, he was becoming more aware of the fact that Clint had turned the interview into something entirely different. It was no longer about exposing weaknesses in Clint's beliefs. It was about exposing weaknesses in the way society viewed change. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a suit, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. "I think what Clint's saying here is that we're all part of this. It's easy to blame the politicians or the system, but if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us are taking action? How many of us are doing the hard work to make things better?" Jason had expected the crowd to be divided, to have some pushback, but instead, the comments from those around him were building on what Clint had said. Everyone, from the young students to the older adults, seemed to be reflecting on the same question: are we doing enough to create the change we talk about? Jason opened his mouth, wanting to respond, but he wasn't sure what to say. How could he challenge Clint now, when the actor's words had touched something deep in the crowd, and in him? Clint, noticing the shift in the conversation, stood up from the bench slowly, his movements deliberate but not rushed. "I don't want to tell anyone how to live their life, but I do know this. If you want to see real change, stop talking about it and start making it happen. Every little action counts. Every small step leads to something bigger." With those final words, Clint began to walk away, leaving Jason standing there, surrounded by an increasingly quiet and introspective crowd. The reporter watched as Clint's figure grew smaller in the distance, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. Jason took a deep breath, his mind swirling with thoughts and realizations. The story he had come to gather had taken a turn he hadn't expected. The headlines he had imagined writing now seemed trivial compared to what had just transpired. For the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about his next question, his next scoop. He was thinking about the deeper question Clint had posed: what am I actually doing to make a difference? And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, the reverberations of Clint's words stayed with everyone. An unspoken challenge to not just talk about change, but to become a part of it. As Clint Eastwood disappeared into the distance, the crowd around Jason Matthews remained rooted in place, as if collectively processing what had just transpired. The murmurs of the park, which had once been filled with casual conversations, now took on a more thoughtful tone. For the first time in Jason's career, he wasn't the one in control of the narrative. He wasn't the one pushing for a headline. He was a participant, a passive observer of a profound moment that left everyone questioning their own role in the world. Jason's hand hovered over his notebook for a moment, as if waiting for some inspiration to strike, but the words wouldn't come. He had started the interview thinking that he could expose the flaws in Clint Eastwood's conservative views, to show the public how out of touch the actor had become. But instead, Clint had done something far more subtle and powerful. He had exposed the flaws in the way Jason himself viewed change, and perhaps even the world around him. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, a man in his late 20s approached Jason. He was wearing a t-shirt with the logo of a local nonprofit organization on it, and his eyes were still bright with the intensity of the conversation. "Hey, man," the young man said, his voice earnest. "That was amazing. What Clint said, about people just talking and not doing, it hit me hard. You're a journalist, right? You've got the power to tell stories. What do you think you're going to do with that power?" Jason blinked, taken aback by the question. He had just been thinking the same thing. The young man was right, he did have the power to tell stories, to shape narratives. But as he stood there in the park, he wondered what kind of stories he had been telling. Were they the kind that truly made a difference? Or had he, like many others, been caught up in sensationalism and controversy, focusing more on the spectacle than on substance? I'm not sure yet, Jason replied honestly, his voice quieter than he intended. But I think Clint was onto something. Maybe it's not about chasing the big headlines. Maybe it's about focusing on the work, the people who are actually making a change, even if no one's paying attention. The young man nodded, a look of understanding on his face. Exactly. You've got to write the stories that matter, the ones that inspire people to act. Not just the ones that get clicks or make noise. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of validation in the young man's words. Here, in the middle of this park, he had just experienced something that had fundamentally shaken his understanding of his role as a journalist. It wasn't just about reporting the news, it was about influencing the conversation, shifting the focus from talk to action. As the young man walked away, Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a flood of messages from his editor or colleagues. But when he checked the screen, he saw something different, an email from the network's editorial board with the subject line, "Clint Eastwood interview, breaking news?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. His fingers hovered over the phone, but he hesitated. He had already recorded enough for a compelling story, but it wasn't the kind of story that would grab the world's attention. He could spin the narrative, twist it to focus on the drama, the age-old political divide between Eastwood's views and the modern-day movements. It would be easy. It would be a surefire way to get the clicks, the headlines, the viral moment. But as he read through Clint's words in his mind, Jason couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't want to sensationalize this moment. This wasn't a story for the masses. This was a story for those who were willing to listen. Not just to the words, but to the lesson behind them. Taking a deep breath, Jason closed the email without responding and put his phone back in his pocket. He had made a decision. This story wasn't going to be about sensationalism. It wasn't going to be about mocking Clint or framing him as an outdated relic. It was going to be about something deeper. It was going to be about the idea of real change, about the quiet work that often goes unnoticed, but is perhaps the most important work of all. Jason walked over to a nearby bench and sat down, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the pressure of needing to be first or to create drama. He felt the weight of responsibility to get this story right. To tell it honestly. The sun had begun to set over Chicago, casting a golden light over the park. The sounds of the city in the distance faded as Jason thought about the people who had inspired change in his own life. People who didn't make a big fuss about it but just did the work. And now, he realized, he had the power to share their stories. He pulled out his notebook and began to write, not the story he had come here for, but a new story, one that would reflect the lessons he had learned today. One that would make people think, make them question, and hopefully, inspire them to stop talking about change and start making it happen. As the last light of the day flickered over the skyline, Jason Matthews wrote the headline that would define his story, "Change is not just a word, it's what you do with it." The following days after the interview in Grant Park were a whirlwind for Jason Matthews. What had started as an ordinary assignment, a chance to challenge one of Hollywood's legendary figures, had turned into a deep internal reckoning. As Jason sat at his desk in the newsroom, his fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of how to approach the story. He had a piece of a headline in his mind, an image of Clint Eastwood walking away from the crowd, but the words refused to come easily. This was different from anything Jason had written before. It wasn't the usual spectacle, it wasn't about controversy or sensationalism. This was something more personal. Something that demanded honesty. Jason had spent the last few days trying to find the right angle for the piece, and with each passing moment, the pressure to write something clickable felt heavier. He could easily spin a narrative about Eastwood's controversial views, creating a tug-of-war between the actor's old-school conservatism and the progressive ideals that were so prevalent in today's media. That story would get clicks. It would get headlines. People would argue over it, share it, and comment on it endlessly. It was the kind of story he had been trained to write, the kind that had made his career. But that wasn't the story he wanted to tell. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The newsroom buzzed around him, reporters chatting over their cubicles, phones ringing off the hook, and editors barking orders from across the room. Jason realized, with startling clarity, that he had never truly questioned the stories he had been writing. He had never really stopped to ask why he was chasing the headlines he was. Sure, it was what people wanted to read, but did it really matter? Had he truly made a difference with his work? Or was he just adding to the noise? The answer seemed simple: he wasn't doing enough. Jason recalled the quiet strength of Clint's words: change isn't about talking. It's about doing. The phrase replayed in his head like a drumbeat. Clint hadn't just given him a lesson in politics or social movements, he had given him a lesson in purpose. The idea that action mattered more than words was not just a political stance, it was a call to live with intention, to focus on substance rather than spectacle. Jason's eyes fell on his notebook, the one he had carried with him during the interview. The pages were filled with scribbled thoughts, half-formed questions, and reflections on the conversation. He flipped through the pages, each word he had written feeling like an echo of what Clint had said. As much as he wanted to write the story he was expected to write, there was something else that gnawed at him, something that told him he needed to do more. Without even realizing it, his fingers began typing, and the story started to form in front of him. He wasn't writing the story that he had been assigned. He wasn't writing for clicks or for drama. He was writing the truth. He began by describing the scene in Grant Park, the vibrant energy of the city, the sounds of the fountain, and the moment when Clint Eastwood had taken control of the conversation with nothing more than his calm, measured words. Jason wrote about the crowd, how they had shifted from casual observers to engaged listeners, hanging on to every word Clint had said. He described the way Clint spoke, not in political jargon, not with anger or a desire to be right, but with a quiet wisdom that invited reflection rather than debate. As Jason wrote, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The words flowed with ease, and he didn't need to rush. This wasn't about getting the story out first. It was about getting it right. And getting it right meant telling the story of that moment, of Clint Eastwood's unspoken message, and how it resonated with him and everyone who had been present. Jason realized something else as he wrote: the real story wasn't about Clint Eastwood. It was about the shift in perspective that had occurred in that park. It was about what happened when people stopped talking and started listening. It was about what it meant to be a journalist and a person. In a world that often valued noise over substance. As he neared the end of the article, Jason included a personal reflection. He wrote about how he had come to question his own role in the world. Was he just contributing to the noise? Or was he, in some small way, helping to shape the world for the better? He typed the final sentence with a quiet sense of conviction: real change doesn't come from what we say, but from what we do, and it starts with listening, learning, and taking action, no matter how small. Jason sat back, looking at the article on his screen. It wasn't the piece he had originally envisioned, but it was the one that felt right. For the first time, he felt like he had written something that mattered. After a few moments of contemplation, Jason clicked send. He knew the editorial board would likely have feedback, perhaps even pushback. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care. He had found his voice again, and it was a voice that wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. Jason leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The noise of the newsroom continued around him, but for the first time in days, it didn't feel overwhelming. He had done the work, and now it was time to wait and see what would happen. As he walked away from his desk, a sense of quiet pride settled over him. The work was just beginning, but it was clear now, he was no longer chasing the headlines, he was going to help shape them. It was early morning when Jason received a response from the editorial board. He had expected the usual quick feedback, an edited draft, a few revisions, perhaps a nudge to make the piece more exciting or controversial. But as he opened the email, he was surprised by the tone. The subject line read, "Impressive story, Jason, let's talk." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Impressive wasn't a word that often made its way into the feedback he received from the board, let alone a word that suggested any kind of approval for something that deviated from the usual sensationalized approach. His hands trembled slightly as he clicked open the email. The message was concise, but it was clear that the editorial team had taken notice of his shift in focus. They commended him for the depth of the story and the honesty in his reflection. The board had rarely seen such a personal and insightful piece come from their reporters, and Jason's ability to capture the essence of Clint Eastwood's message, without sensationalizing it, had caught their attention. However, they also recognized the challenge in Jason's new direction. They were eager to discuss how he could refine the piece for the publication. Jason's phone rang just as he finished reading the email. It was Amanda, his editor. She sounded unusually upbeat. "Jason," she began, her voice warm, "I just read your draft. And I have to say, I'm impressed. This is different. You've really captured something here. But I need you to come in for a meeting. We need to discuss the direction for this article." Jason was caught off guard. He had expected to be asked to revise the piece or perhaps soften some of the more reflective parts. But instead, Amanda seemed genuinely interested in exploring this new approach. It felt like validation, a sign that what he had written had broken through the usual expectations of sensationalism and found its own path. "Sure, I'll be there in an hour," Jason replied, his voice steady despite the flurry of thoughts running through his mind. He hung up the phone, his mind already racing with possibilities. What if the editorial board wanted to completely rewrite his piece? What if they didn't understand what he was trying to convey? What if they insisted on pushing it back toward the usual headlines and controversy? As he walked to the meeting, Jason reflected on how different this moment felt compared to all the others he had experienced in his career. There was a sense of unease, yes, but it was different than before. He wasn't afraid of the editorial team's feedback, it was the fear of returning to his old, easy ways of chasing stories with shock value that made him uneasy. When Jason entered the meeting room, he was greeted with a sense of curiosity and anticipation. Amanda and the editorial board were gathered around the table, each of them holding copies of his article. There was a brief pause as they all looked at him, the room filled with an energy that he wasn't accustomed to. It felt as though they weren't just looking at a reporter, they were looking at someone who had opened up a new door, a door that could lead to a different kind of journalism. Amanda was the first to speak. "Jason, I've been with this publication for 10 years, and I've rarely seen something so authentic come across my desk. You've captured a rare moment with Clint Eastwood, and you've done it with depth and insight. That's not easy, especially in today's world of clickbait headlines and 24/7 media cycles." Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I wasn't sure if it was enough. I mean, it's not the usual kind of story we write, right?" Amanda smiled, leaning forward. "That's exactly it, Jason. You took a risk. You chose to tell the story of a moment that could have easily been overshadowed by the noise of the world around it. And you focused on the heart of it, on the message behind it. You made it personal. That's what we need more of in journalism. Real stories that matter." Jason felt a mix of relief and pride wash over him. For the first time in his career, he realized that he wasn't just chasing a story for the sake of the headlines. He was telling a story that had substance. A story that could create real dialogue, not just stir controversy for the sake of ratings. Amanda continued, "But here's the thing. The challenge now is how we position this piece for the audience. I don't want to change the core of what you've written. I think that's important, but we need to find a way to draw people in. We need to make them understand that this isn't just another celebrity interview. It's about something much bigger. How do we make people care about this conversation? Jason thought for a moment. Maybe we focus on the bigger picture. Not just Clint's views or his political stance, but the way he framed real change. People are so caught up in talking about change, they want to see action, not just words. I think that's the story here. That it's not about picking a side or scoring points, it's about how we all take responsibility for the change we want to see in the world. Amanda nodded, clearly impressed with his perspective. Exactly. And we need to make sure that message gets across in the opening. We can't just present it as an ordinary interview. We need to let people know that this is a conversation that challenges them. It makes them think about how they live, how they contribute. We need that hook that pulls them in. Jason took a deep breath. It felt like a challenge, but it was the kind of challenge he had been waiting for his entire career. It wasn't about writing for clicks or popularity. It was about writing for impact. I think I know how to approach it, Jason said, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in a long time. Let's start with the question, why do we talk so much about change without actually doing it? Why do we let the noise drown out the real work? That's the question I want to explore. And Clint Eastwood's words are the catalyst for that conversation. Jason knew this wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. He was committed to continuing the work, to finding the stories that mattered, and to using his voice to inspire others to do the same. The work was far from over. But Jason Matthews was no longer just a reporter. He was a storyteller on a mission, one that would change the world, one story at a time.